Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. We've been doing a series for 2+ years of all kinds of aspects of health, and occasionally we throw in some of the psychological, mental things. But I felt it might be appropriate at this point to take a break out of, we were getting heavily into the diet, the soil, nutritional deficiencies, etc., etc. So I thought it would be nice to take a little break and do something a little different, still related in a way, but giving you something to think about, something to maybe provoke you, inspire you to look into some of the aspects of yourself and to be more knowledgeable of what's going on with other people. So I'm calling this today Mind Belief Paradigm, and we'll talk about how all that comes together in a minute. But I'm starting out by saying what you see is what you believe, and that's kind of a basic hypothesis as far as I'm concerned related to the mind. We've always heard it the other way around. You'll believe it when you see it, but actually it's the reverse. You'll see it when you believe it. And that one is maybe a little difficult to swallow, but basically what we believe determines what we see in the world. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. But I want you to think of something in our everyday life that we can use to relate to how the mind, brain, and everything works. Now, you know, there's a big controversy, has been for years. The reductionist materialists say that there is no real thing called the mind, that the mind is an artifact from the brain. In other words, no brain, no mind. Now, there's a lot of evidence that's come along to refute that, but we're not even going to get into that at this point. We're going to discuss some interesting work that was done many, many years ago. As I was getting into, actually, I started into the health field more from the psychological, emotional side, and ended up being hired to do a series of programs for people in the sales field that would help them uncover what was keeping them from realizing their potential, or not just in their work, but in their life period. And so I had been working with and learning a lot. In fact, I had done a real intensive 2-year program at Cleveland Psychiatric Institute. And so anyhow, this executive that had a series of offices throughout the state of Ohio wanted somebody to come in and see if he could get his people off a dead center. Now, there were a few, of course, as there always is, that were doing very well, but the bulk of it seemed to be bogged down a bit. And so he wanted to see if he could open them up to start moving and begin to not only be successful for themselves, but for his big operation. And having studied a lot of these things, one of the first real eye-openers, I guess, to me was a autobiography by a neurologist, psychiatrist, medical doctor by the name of Dr. John C. Lilly. Now, Dr. Lilly had come along as a researcher. I suppose he did some work with people, but at that point he was really big in research. He was actually hired by the government to go down to Miami and work with the dolphins and to do a lot of research with dolphins. And so he spent quite a bit of time in the Florida Keys working with dolphins, trying to understand more about them and how they communicated, and basically anything he could find out, because they knew they were highly intelligent and have actually probably the largest brain per body size of any of the mammals. And in that period of time, he learned a lot about communication, and especially learned a lot about the dolphins. And as a result of that project, he published a couple of books. One was called Man and Dolphin, and one was called The Mind of Dolphin. And they were very good studies, and he found out how actually intelligent and how capable of communication they really were. So at any rate, it opened some things up for himself. And so he was later then hired, again, funded by the government, to do another project because LSD had come on the market. And they wanted to know something about what it did with the brain, mind. And so he ended up being head of this project, where they actually took him, put him in a huge tank of water and gave him oxygen so he could breathe. But it was in such a way that he couldn't hear any outside sounds, he couldn't see any outside visions, he could not touch anything with any touch sensation because they suspended him in water. They changed the water buoyancy so that he actually was suspended. So he was touching nothing, seeing nothing, hearing nothing except himself. And then, after he had been doing that for a while and understanding what was going on with him, and that became known as an isolation tank. And later he did a lot more work with it. He had a lot of other people working with it, and he wrote about it. In fact, he wrote a book called The Deep Self. So at any rate, he was then ingested LSD, which is actually a serotonin agonist in the brain. What it does, it attaches to the serotonin receptor sites and overstimulates them to the point that you basically are off in another world. And in fact, the modern drug Prozac is a offshoot of that, made by the same company actually. I mentioned that before, but I don't know, sometimes I put in a lot of facts and it's kind of passing and it doesn't always stick. So at any rate, it was the same pharmaceutical that made the LSD, hoped to market it, and because of what happened down the road, as probably most people are familiar with, they never did get on the market as a therapeutic drug. And anyhow, he had all of these hallucinations, trips, if you want to call it that, and he wrote about that, and that was all included in his autobiography, The Center of the Cyclone. But anyhow, he continued to investigate with his wife and wrote another book called The Dyadic Cyclone. But that's not what I'm getting at. He has a lot of books out, and they're very worthwhile reading because it's like an investigative life he led, learning more and more about the mind and how it works. And one of his very beginning books was called Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer. And so he likened the mind as the software to run the hardware, the brain, and the body. And he said that there's these different levels of programs. What makes us different is the fact that in our system, we have these higher level programs he refers to as metaprograms, and then metaprograms, which meta means like around or above. And so he sensed that we had these different levels or tiers in our brain and mind, and that they, in many cases, kicked in automatically. Now, you know, I'm sure in your own life, and probably most people know by now, that there's an unconscious level that drives us in certain directions that, other than seeing the effects of it, we don't know a whole lot about it. And more often than not, we don't know how to make any change in it, so we kind of feel we're stuck with it. And he said, above all of this programming, there's a survival program that kicks in so that when you're under threat of life, that kicks in automatically and overrides everything else until the crisis or the threat passes. And so it's a good book to read, and it's still available. In fact, as far as I know, all of his books are available. It appears that he finally died. He was not born in 1915. He finally died in 2001. But he lived in Florida for a long time, and he did a tremendous amount of things. He was a meticulous investigator and came up with a lot of interesting things you can do, which I did back along the way, which I found to be very useful. And I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about all those, but anyhow, he's probably one of the biggest investigators, and he got into this this level of perception and understanding, kind of like what we're talking about, meaning that you get what you see. In other words, you have the belief system first, and the belief system then is what creates a worldview, and the worldview then is the way we interact with and perceive the world, for the better or the worse. Now, as you see in the behavior of some people, and especially the criminal behavior and or fatal behavior, as we've been seeing a lot in our society today, these programs are running and they kick in, and they're because that person has a perception of reality, and that perception can be distorted, as Lilly found out with the LSD. It can cause you to have a hallucinated perception of the world in which everybody around you becomes a threat, and you become so life-preserving that one of those meta programs kicks in and says, I've got to defend myself, and everyone else is the enemy, and so you start killing people. But it's, in my mind, what's actually magnified all that are the psychoactive drugs that's been used. When I first started psychiatry, there was only a handful. Now there's a bucket full or even a bushel basket full of very powerful psychoactive drugs that interfere with the brain chemistry like crazy. And so that, if you add a magnifier on top of an already difficult problem, it can become disastrous, as we've seen happen. Now, nobody's talking about it. When you look on TV, they're trying to blame them, oh, they're just evil, or this is the problem. One group said, no, it's the guns. If it weren't for the guns, they wouldn't be able to do that. But, you know, a machete is pretty deadly, too. And there's a lot of places in the world where they didn't have guns, so they use cleavers. In fact, remember on international television, a man was hacked to death and beheaded with a knife and a cleaver over in London. So the weapon is not the cause, whether it's a baseball bat, a butcher knife, an axe, a machete. They're all deadly, but the problem is not the instrument, it's the person that is no longer perceiving the world as it is, if in fact anyone can. But let's say they have less perception, and this survival mechanism has kicked in, this meta program, and now they see what they see. They see the world as going through their filters, and we're going to talk about the filters in a minute. At any rate, Lilly did a lot of things to help people break out of these paradigms, and we'll talk about a paradigm in a minute, what that is, but just to say it's a box that you're in. And so you can't see beyond the box. Your whole world gets limited to that box, and it sets the limits. So at any rate, he was very good at getting all this information together, and he developed a series of recordings that I went through and used in some of my training workshops, and it gets down to a program, basically, in the mind, one of the programs. And here's what he said. This is the principle about all that. In the province of the mind, what one believes to be true either is true or becomes true within certain limits. These limits are to be found experimentally and experientially. When so found, these limits turn out to be further beliefs to be transcended. In other words, we start working through levels and getting back to programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer. We have these program levels. The difference between us and a computer, you put a program in, and that is the program, and that computer is limited to what the parameters of that program are. In our program and our mind, wherever it's recorded, my suspicion is recorded through the whole body if you look at Candace Pert's work. At any rate, he said that as you test this out, what these limits are of your belief, and you find that they're not accurate, then and you find that by experimenting and experiencing it. You know, with the human biocomputer, we're inside the computer, or the computer's inside us, however you want to look at it. And so therefore we can transcend a particular belief, but then he said it turns out that these further beliefs are also to be transcended until ultimately, in the province of the mind, there are no limits. And so he had this tied into a program which he had created, basically out at Big Sur, California, at the Big Sur Institute, and they had people come from all over the world there, and he put them through a lot of these programs. They were used with psychiatrists in training, psychologists in training. He had a huge impact at one time, and then of course he did these isolation tanks where you float suspended, and he did a lot with that, and I mentioned the book The Deep Self if you want to find out more about those. And it was intriguing what happened. Now that the use of those have come and gone, and then back again and so forth, and there are still people doing it. It's a good way to help expand your perceptual capability to go through the process. Now in today's use of those, it's totally dark and there's no sound, and the water is at body temperature, so you have no sensual perception, you don't feel anything. But they load the water with magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salts, which makes you very buoyant. You can't sink in it. So you lay on the water, so to speak, and then everything is totally quiet, everything is totally black, and your mind then, what he found, creates your reality because there's nothing coming in through the senses. So it's dealing with what's inside instead of what's outside. And he found it to be very effective to help people get rid of a lot of their problems. But he goes one step further. He said, ultimately, as you go up through these belief levels and you transcend those by experiment and experience, you ultimately reach a point where you find that in the mind there are no limits. But he did say, however, in the province of the body there are definite limits not to be transcended. Now, I would say that probably now has been proven not to be true too, because now we've been able to do things in terms of changing the body, correcting it, changing things like DNA, which they said could not be done, and now it is. And of course the whole concept of epigenetics has come along, which are controllers that control gene expression. And that what we're finding is we didn't really know very much. You know, the reductionist materialist approach based on Newtonian physics was that the universe and everybody is like a machine or a clock, and it runs in a certain way, and mathematically, once you know the formula, you can predict what's going to happen in the future, you can derive what happened in the past, because it's like this clock running, you know, that one is followed by 2, by 3, by 4, and it's that simple. Or if you run it backward, it's 3, 2, 1, but it follows a definite, precise sequence. Now, that works good in general. I mean, it's accurate enough for navigation in space and all the things they've been doing. However, when you get in down to the core of it, then quantum physics becomes the real core. That's something of this 1900s, the 20th century, the work of a whole group of scientists that introduced something totally different. And so we don't even have time to talk about it. I mentioned before about Fred Alan Wolf, who is a quantum physicist, and he wrote a book called Star Wave, which is about the mind and quantum physics. And you will find it interesting, very difficult to wade through his concepts. You really have to stretch your thinking to grasp it. Lilly was kind of in that border where quantum physics had not influenced so much in the mind side as far as thinking. It was there in principle, but it wasn't perceived at that time. But anyhow, if you want to get a good basic understanding, I would say that John Lilly is a big one to start with. I was impressed with it, and it had a big influence. And I don't have time to talk to you about all the implications. But any of his books, so one of the last books he wrote was called John Lilly Up to Now, because he was always writing about what he learned and his experiences. And he was an explorer, basically, of the mind, and continued right up until his death, I guess, in 2001, to continue to experiment, investigate, and write about what was going on. And what I was reading, I'm not reading this out of the book, there was an interview done by another psychological researcher, and he was perusing with Lilly about his life and about some of the things he had done. And so he asked him again to talk about this paradigm in a province of mind. What one believes to be true either is true or becomes true, the limits to be found both experientially and experimentally. And as I say, that was part of a tape program, which maybe some later time we'll talk about. Now, the other big person that we ought to mention, because that's where the word paradigm came from, is a guy by the name of Thomas Kuhn. And this is an article written about him, and it says, Thomas Kuhn, the man who changed the way the world looked at science. This was written in 2012, and it says, 50 years ago, a book by Thomas Kuhn altered the way we look at the philosophy behind science, as well as introducing the much abused phrase, paradigm shift. And I'm sure you've run into that if you haven't already. You might want to go look at his book, which is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And what he said is that we reach these steps where we have a belief system about the world, and so everybody operates as though this belief is true, with the exception of a few perceptive people who see beyond it. And at the beginning, they're considered to be heretics, radicals, uninformed, ignorant, because science knows that this is the way things are. And so what they do is they create this box, and the box is the paradigm. So when they do research, do they go beyond? No, they stay within the box, because right off when they do research, they eliminate certain things that could be true because it's not fitting in the box. So they only look around. It's like you have a sandbox and you believe that's the world. So you start digging around in the sand, seeing what you can find there. And of course, if you have cats around, you might find some things you'd rather not stick your fingers in. But nonetheless, it's the idea that everything that is right or true is inside the parameters of this box. And it was basically like a paradigm. And to move forward, somebody has to break out of that box and say, wait a minute, there's a lot more to the world than just what's in this box. Now, interesting, there's a lot of examples that you can bring up. And if you think back, remember that Galileo Galilei was almost executed because he said, contrary to what the prevailing paradigm was, and of course in that day the church was the controller of people's thoughts as much as possible. They had declared that the Earth is the center of the universe, and all of the other things, the sun, the moon, all these other things, stars that we see, they move around the Earth, which is the center. And that's called the geocentric or Earth-centered universe. Now, that was the paradigm of the day, and so it was not proper to think beyond that. And so here came a guy by the name of Copernicus who started getting into those areas that, well, I don't know that the Earth is the center. I think in our system, the sun is the center, and we move around the sun. And the church said, heresy, heresy. Not so. You can't do that. I mean, you can't have people thinking that. And they tried to control thinking. And so with Galileo, he got a built telescope, and he started studying and looking. He said, yeah, it's true. It is the sun that's the center, and we move around the sun as well as some other bodies move around the sun. And so a paradigm ultimately gets broken when enough people perceive it to be accurate. The broken paradigm is more accurate than the previous paradigm, and so at some point, suddenly, especially some of the older people who die off, who were the diehards that said, no, it's absolutely that way, then the paradigm begins to change. And then a new paradigm comes along, and it's that new paradigm then that everybody believes. And so the geocentric finally changed, and the church was forced to either look like they're ignorant or that they're recalcitrant, which means stubborn to a fault. To not be perceived like that, they had to eventually change their position because the new paradigm had so much evidence that they had no choice. They would have looked like they were ignorant and outdated so bad, they would have lost control. And because the big thing was they wanted to keep control, they had to be flexible to move to the next level. Okay, so then as time went on, those paradigms changed, and we've learned even more, which we won't have time to talk about, but that was an example of a paradigm and a paradigm shift. The shift was, okay, I guess the sun really is the center, it's not the earth. And so the 4-minute mile was a paradigm. It can be applicable to all kinds of areas, whether it's science or what it is. And so when the 4-minute mile became the wall, the barrier, no one could run a mile in less than 4 minutes. And of course, medicine came into the play, and they had to proclaim a man cannot run a mile under 4 minutes, or he will collapse and die. He'll be totally exhausted. It's not possible. And so that reinforced the paradigm, and everything was great until one day Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, and all of a sudden there was a paradigm shift. A new view came that you can run a mile faster than 4 minutes and not drop dead. Because within a couple of weeks after Bannister broke it, several people who had been trying for years and couldn't do it, including Bannister himself, and now all of a sudden a new paradigm exists. You can run a mile. And the same thing was with pole vaulting. They had a height nobody could ever exceed that, and they did, and then there was another height nobody could exceed, and then they've done that. So they keep getting broken. Those are small examples. I also remember that in the early days of the automobile, as man is inclined to do, he figured out how to use the automobile to do something more challenging and exciting, and that was to race. And so they started racing cars, and those big, long, torpedo-shaped bodies with those great big wheels on them would run around the track, and however, there was a barrier. The barrier was you cannot drive the car faster than 60 miles per hour, a mile a minute. If you go beyond that, it's disastrous. You could die, all kind of things. And guess what? Medicine stepped in and says, absolutely, you cannot go past 60 miles per hour. If you do, the pressure against your chest is going to force the air out of your lungs and you'll die. They joined into the paradigm until, guess what? Somebody drove faster than 60 miles an hour. They didn't die, and now the land speed record with the jet car is between over 600 miles an hour. That's going pretty fast, like a mile a second. Anyhow, again, a paradigm, and it gets down to men driving in races could not exceed 60 miles an hour, no matter how they tried, until all of a sudden you could. And once you could, then a lot of people could drive beyond 60, and they could make cars go faster and faster. So I hope you're beginning to see that how we perceive or believe is what we end up seeing. Our beliefs control what we see. So Thomas Kuhn is a good book to read. So if you want two good books, read Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, and read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Now there's a lot more to it than that, but the bottom line is that science isn't add this truth on and this truth on, discard this, but a continuous movement or momentum of arriving closer and closer to the absolute truth. What it amounts to is it's done in jumps or steps. You have this paradigm and you force everything to fit into the box until one day there's too many things that doesn't fit in the box. Then you have to expand the walls of the box wider to include the things that didn't fit. And it's always that one bug that doesn't fit with the theory that eventually can shake the whole foundation of it and cause you to reformulate a whole new theory because it just doesn't work. Okay, so how does all that figure with us? I was going to throw in a couple other things because they were funny. The flat earth. You know, there was at a period of time back before Columbus that the earth is flat, and if you saw far enough, you'll fall off the edge of the earth. And so anytime anybody talked about making a long trip across the ocean, they would say, "Oh no, don't do it. You'll never come back because you'll sail off the edge and be lost." And that would be the end of it. And of course, Columbus kept sailing and sailing, and he didn't fall off. He just kept going and going till he came to what now is North America. And so the irony of it is that there is still in existence a flat earth society who still believes that all of the stuff is a fraud that tries to show that the earth is round. All these pictures they present are all fake, and that the earth still really is flat. They have refused to adapt it, but it's a fact. So they only see any evidence that they will ever accept is evidence that shows that the earth is flat. And it's hard to think that in our time that could be, but it is. And there's other things that people believe. I remember people saying man will never go to the moon because Jules Verne's in his science fiction talked about the trip to the moon, and no, impossible. Man will never get there. And I think the same thing was true with the airplane. Remember the old saying was, if men were meant to fly, he'd be born with wings, or about smoking, if men were meant to smoke, they would be born with a chimney, and all kinds of stuff. And to all of that, I used to add mine. Men and women were meant to run around naked, they'd be born without any clothes on. Okay, so we talk about the reason that the beliefs don't allow us to see things as they are, but the way we expect them to be. In other words, the way we believe them to be, that's what we see, those paradigms or those boxes or those lenses. Now, what happens is when we're born into this world, we get installed into our mind a set of filters. And those filters delete, distort, and generalize all the information coming in through the senses. So, two people can watch the same event and both describe it differently and both be telling the truth as they saw it. And if you were to put them on a lie detector, they would pass because that's what they saw. But what they don't realize is that the filters that are in their mind that delete, distort, and generalize cause their senses to either shut it out totally or distort it in a certain way. In other words, that person may have been somebody else, but in their mind they wanted it to be a particular person, so that's what they saw. They saw that person, and they could swear that that was the person they saw. And to generalize, these big general statements like all men are the same, all women are the same, all this is the same, never can this happen. Those are these big sweeping generalizations. And so we're programmed with those when we're very young. And as I said, we don't really, in a broadcast of this nature, we hardly can touch the surface. But I want to give you enough of it to really get you thinking. And so I just found another article that I pulled off the internet. There's so much on there. You can be overwhelmed, and of course, as I've said before, you have to look at all the different pluses and minuses, the fors and against, and see who really, in your mind, you have to make your own decision. Which of these people really have the story, or do neither of them have the story, or are both right because they're only talking about a portion of a bigger truth. Anyhow, what this says, with eyes above the horizon, a search for clarity among the chaos. And so the actual title of this is called perception filters. How what we see is not really what is there. So I sometimes think, do any of us know what is actually real? We all come out of childhood with a set of filters programmed into us more often than not by our parents, and those filters control our lives in the sense that our senses do not get everything into us that's happening around us when we have a filter involved. You know, it's like the old idea of the rose-colored glasses, which we've talked about so much. When you wear rose-colored glasses, the world looks rose-colored. Now, if you're not aware you have glasses on, you could argue up and down and get very furious at someone and say, wait a minute, it's rose, can't you see it? And the other person say, no, I don't see it, it's not rose at all. Well, it is, absolutely. I mean, how could anybody be so stupid that you can't see the world as rose? But they are not aware that they have that rose filter on. And so they'll continue to insist until at some point something happens that they realize they've got glasses on, and they take them off and they say, oh, I guess that person was right. I guess it isn't rose-colored. So personal growth is a series of things, such as Dr. Lilly had put together, a series of steps that cause you to be able to shed more and more of these filters. Will we ever get rid of all of them? I don't know, because they involve so much. Society is as we see it to be. And we see it in a way that is consistent with what we believe. So our beliefs control our vision, they control our hearing, they control everything. And it's, number one, becoming aware that you have the belief, and then number two, looking at, as John Lilly said, experimenting and experiencing until you say, okay, let's test this and see if it's really true. And that's when you start to break some of the barriers and you start to diminish the filters. Now, as I say, will you ever get rid of them totally? I doubt it, but at least you'll get rid of enough of them so that you'll improve the clarity of your vision. It's interesting, in one of the biblical comments, Jesus said, how can you try to pick a splinter out of your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own eye? In other words, if you can't see to get a splinter out of this guy's eye when you've got this big log filling your eye up, you better remove that first. And it's a true principle. Now, there's some programs that are very helpful, and I've utilized, in fact, that's what I utilized in the workshops I was telling you about. One's called transactional analysis. It was originally established, or I should say put together, by his own work with patients, Eric Berne, B-E-R-N-E, and he began to understand ego states that we live in, and how those ego states of us interact with the ego states of other people, which is called a transaction. And of course, the system became the analysis of those transactions and all the implications of those transactions. And very fascinating. He put it in a language which was easy to understand and kind of humorous, and he created, some people probably heard of the I'm okay or not okay idea. That's a part of transactional analysis, and there was a book written by Thomas Harris, one called Scripts People Live, which is, and based on the underlying principles, you write a script for your life, which is your story, and it all has to do with becoming something other than what you are, because what you are is not acceptable to you, because somebody else's feedback at a very early age made you think it was not okay to be who you are, so you had to become somebody else. So you write the script, you pick the right costumes, the right people, the right theme, and you start to play out the script in your life, which of course isn't you, and it leads to all kinds of problems. So it's a good system of awareness to become aware of some of your filters, because it's definitely a part of that. And then another system that came along called neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, and that's a way of changing. It's what I call a cognitive therapy, in a sense, because cognitive means you become aware how you're perceiving something, and you change the perception. You're cognizant of it. You recognize what's going on, and then you can make a conscious change in the way you do it. And so NLP became a good change system because the basis of it is the effects on the neurology of linguistics. In other words, the words, the grammar, and so forth affect the nervous system, and hence makes a change in us. So it became a very good way of making change. So the two of those together were pretty good. And if you threw in a third one called the Enneagram, which was an understanding of the basic types of people, that you tend to fall in some general classifications, they fit well together with this. So between the three of those, that trio makes a really good system for becoming aware and making change. And so then what you do is you change the paradigm. And it's interesting because there was a study done just a few years ago, and we've run over a little time already. There was a study done called learned helplessness. It started out with laboratory animals, and they found the same thing in humans. If humans learn to be helpless, then they can't get any place. They can't do anything. They're dependent. And if you can break the person out of that and make them independent, once that happens, whether animal or human, they never go back to it. Now, why is that pertinent? Because it is a belief system. The belief system is that you're helpless. And therefore you have to be taken care of. You have to be dependent on something or somebody else. And instead of saying, I'm independent, I can take care of myself. I can make my own way. And so we have that tremendous amount of that in our society. And in many cases, it looks like the powers that be are trying to push everybody into that position. Why would they want to do that? Well, it's much better and easier to control people when they're totally dependent on you. If they don't behave, you can pull their food away from them, or a few chips that they're getting you can pull away. And therefore, they have nowhere to go, because in their mind, they can't be independent. They've learned to be helpless, but you give them a breakthrough and help them walk out of that, and once they get out, they're not going to want to be back there again. The feeling of independence is a feeling of freedom, and instead of being bound and imprisoned to that dependence, now you are liberated and you're independent, and you can make your own way, and there's all kind of things about it. And we've done the same thing with medicine today. We've made ourselves dependent on the pharmaceuticals and the medical system, which is bleeding everyone dry, because we were willing to buy into a concept, one germ, one disease, one cure, and it sounded so simple, and we're willing to pay trillions of dollars to try to take care of a problem that isn't even the problem. Now, we've talked about that before, but I'm just showing you how this whole idea of belief system, paradigm, and our behavior, that belief system controls what we do. So I thought this would be good to kind of open our eyes and show you that what the real problem is, and that we all come out of childhood with all this garbage, and that's what I call this garbage. We come out of childhood with this garbage, and once you see where you are and where you see what your blindness is, then you can expand beyond that. You can get out of that small box, that small paradigm, get out of the sandbox and move into the beach and go from the beach to the world. The expansion is limitless once you can break down the barriers. So I hope I've given you a little bit of provocation to look into some of these things, because it's extremely important, in today's world especially, that we understand that then the problems that we're facing make a lot more sense if you have all these people stuck in all these belief systems, and they are fearful. There's a certain fear that even though it's miserable, you know what to expect. And it's the expectation knowledge that gives you a certain comfort, no matter how much misery you may be experiencing in the whole picture. you feel this comfort, well, at least I know what's going to happen. And that makes some people feel better. But I think anyone who really wants to get on with their life, and they want to enjoy their life, and they want to be creative, and they want to succeed at what they want to succeed, they need to become aware of all that and start shedding some of that debris so that they can move on with their life. Anyhow, I've given you enough to get you started, and all those books are available that I mentioned. I didn't even hardly get into everything that's out there. I didn't give you all of Lilly's books, but at least enough to get you started. So read Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, read The Structure of Scientific Revolution, read a basic book on TA by Transactional Analysis by Eric Byrne, and the 2 basic books by Bandler and Grinder on transactional analysis called The Structure of Magic, Volumes 1 and Volume 2, kind of lays the basics out. If that seems too heavy, you can find some single volumes that like NLP Up to Date or NLP Today, something of that nature, to give you an overview of what they're about. But you find that they're really fascinating and can make tremendous change in your life. So be sure and go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and we'll be looking forward to being with you again this next time, and I'll see if I can dredge up something that's somewhat interesting to kind of keep you on your toes and make you healthy. So until the next time, I'm hoping that you will have dug into a lot of this stuff and that you're on your way to a lot of tweaking of your life.